So,
We're back in session.
okay, who would have next?
Your Honor, I have Ms. Cross briefly.
Okay, and I will need to explain to the jury that that's out of sequence, but it's for judicial economy. One way of putting it.
Previously provided the state a copy of her opinion letter, but more important, her CV.
And she is also,
I have it buried somewhere.
Sure.
Maybe I could get the court, if you have an extra copy.
and she is also a DNA expert, correct?
Yes, forensic biologist.
Yes, Your Honor.
Which encompasses DNA.
What?
It's forensic biology, which encompasses DNA.
Okay, right. Like the TBI agent is forensic scientist. Oh, she's sitting in here. The other one's in here. All of them.
All rise.
All right, please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, let me explain something to you very briefly. What we're about to have now, the next witness is Mr. Hopkins' witness, or Mr. Coons' witness, which is unusual. Ordinarily, we have all the witnesses for one side testify, and then the other side presents its proof. Well, in this case, because we have these experts, and because Mr. Hopkins' expert is from out of town, and would have to just stay here for a couple of more days or a day and a half or whatever, she will be testifying out of order. So you'll just keep her testimony in context, okay? All right? Mr. Hopkins?
Yes, Your Honor.
And she is a DNA expert also. She's a forensic biologist and expert in DNA.
Do you swear to tell the truth, so help you God?
I do. Please.
I know Your Honor made the announcement, actual states stipulated her qualifications.
Yeah.
All right. For the record.
I'll keep that short. Ms. Cross, would you introduce yourself to the court?
Yes, my name is Katherine Cross, Katherenecross.
And Ms. Cross, what is your area of expertise?
My area of expertise is forensic biology, which includes serology and DNA analysis.
Can you just give a brief summary of your educational background?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree in biology with a concentration in genetics from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. I also have a Master of Science degree in pharmacology with a concentration in forensic DNA and serology from the University of Florida.
And what is your, how are you currently employed?
I am currently employed as the DNA technical leader and a forensic analyst with Guardian Forensic Sciences, which is in Abington, Pennsylvania.
How long have you been with Guardian Forensics?
I have been with Guardian Forensics since January of 2011.
And how long have you actually been in the field of forensic biology?
I've been in this field for approximately 27 years now.
And in that 27 years, have you testified as an expert previously,
Yes, I have.
including in courts in the state of Tennessee?
Yes, I have.
You were present, or were you present, for the testimony of the three previous DNA persons we've heard from in this case?
Yes, I have.
That includes the people from cybergenetics and Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the Metro National Police Department.
That's correct.
Before your testimony here today and before hearing their testimony, did you review any documents or materials in this case?
Yes, I did.
And can you just briefly tell the jury what it is that you reviewed?
I reviewed multiple DNA reports and the associated case files for those reports, and those case files would contain the notes, the actual raw data that the analysts used to make their conclusions and their interpretations, as well as some miscellaneous documents. There may have been police reports, autopsy reports, and other information that was also provided for review.
And were all those materials that you mentioned, those provided to you through me by the state of Tennessee?
That's correct.
And many of those documents have they been made exhibits here in this trial?
Yes, they have.
Are there any other outside documents related to this case that you reviewed that the jury's not heard about?
The only thing that has been referred to, but I don't believe have been made exhibits, would be the actual case files themselves, and that is an accumulation of some 2,000 some odd pages of documentation.
Would this be like the background that's used in the analysis that's done that ends up in the final reports we've heard about?
Right. The final report is a summary of all of the information that's in the case file.
I want to ask you about the foreign allele or foreign DNA matter that's been testified to in this case, specifically regarding the report done by the Metro Nashville Police Department lab. It's a 14-page document summary that was made in this case.
Yes,
Have you reviewed that summary?
I have.
And have you reviewed the underlying reports that go along with that summary?
Yes, I have.
Did you hear the testimony of Ms. Mack regarding the number of foreign DNA profiles that were recovered?
Yes, I did.
Did you disagree with her assessment of that number?
Well, the answer that she gave was that there are two. And in my assessment, that may actually be there are two profiles, but it is not on two items of evidence. One of those profiles actually shows up on about 4 pieces of evidence.
Let me break that down. So there are multiple partial profiles.
That's correct.
Okay. And on how many pieces of evidence do you think that those partial profiles appear?
Well, there are multiple partial profiles that consist of only 1 or 2 alleles. Those I am not counting because they may be consistent with the foreign profile that has many, many more alleles in it, because really that's not enough material. They're consistent with, but I can't say that it's coming from the same person. But there were 4 samples that were found on the left breast, the left bra, the waistband of the pants, and also the inside window frame that were tested that produced a foreign profile. When you compare those foreign profiles against each other, they are very similar, such that it could be one individual leaving that profile in all of those samples. They're not exact matches because in some cases, we may have the profile showing up at areas A, B, and C, and somewhere else it might be at B, C, and D. But at B and C, where they overlap, we can say, hey, this is the same profile we're seeing, could be the same person. So when we do that across all of the partial profiles, we do see that it's consistent with potentially being the same person.
Did you hear the testimony regarding the partial profile that was found, the male profile found on the bed frame in this case?
Yes, I did hear that.
And would that have been the bed frame that was in the victim's bedroom?
That is my understanding.
Did that partial male DNA profile match any of the ones related to the left breast, the windowsill, the waistband, the bra?
No, that was a completely different male profile. The ones that came off of the 4 items I've previously mentioned could not have come from the same individual that was on the bed frame.
So your testimony is that maybe those 4 could have matched, but you don't know for certain, but they didn't. You can't exclude them, I suppose, from being in the same person.
Right, unless you have a reference to compare it to, you can't say whether they are in fact from the same person or not, but they do have enough similarities that it is entirely possible that all of those samples came from the same individual.
But could you exclude those 4 from the partial profile from the bed frame?
Yes, whoever left the profile on the partial profile on the bed frame is definitely a different individual.
And did either the 4 that we're talking about, the broad waistband, windowsill, left breast, and the one on the bed frame, could you definitively say that none of those 5 match for Coons Jr.?
That's correct, they do not match.
And did they match any of the other samples that were taken and compared by any of these labs?
No, the alleles that I was looking at were alleles that were foreign to all of the references that were provided.
Based on that, is it possible that there are at least 2 other males' DNA left on that scene for which we have no match?
Well, there is definitely 2 other individuals' DNA that is unaccounted for by any of the references that we have.
We've heard some reference, a lot of reference in the last testimony to YSTR testing. Are you familiar with YSTR testing?
Yes, I am.
The YSTR testing that we heard about in this case from the last witness, did you hear the discussion about it being a partial strand of YSTR DNA?
It is a partial profile from the YSTRs, yes.
So that is not a complete profile.
That's correct.
And did you hear the discussion about the race of potential person that left that partial strand?
I heard the statistical references to the different racial groups for each of those samples.
Is there anything from your research or experience that makes you have a different opinion about it?
Not that how the statistic was generated, because that is the standard way of generating the statistical calculation, but one of the things that we can look at with these statistical calculations is in which racial group is it more likely to see this profile occur. And all 3 of these, the least likely was Caucasian. Now, that's not to say it can't be, but it is statistically the least likely racial group based on those profiles.
I'm going to ask you briefly about 2 types of DNA we've heard about, trace and transfer DNA. Are those the same thing?
A lot of times, transfer DNA is referred to as trace, but not all trace DNA is necessarily transfer. Trace is simply telling the amount of DNA that is there, and it's just a low level of DNA. Transfer is the mechanism by how the DNA gets there. And there's 2 types of transfer. There's direct transfer, where I touch this bench and my DNA can be detected on this bench. Then there is an indirect transfer, or what we call secondary transfer, and this is when there's an intermediate. So if I were to touch this desk, and then the next person to come up here and testify touches the desk and then goes and touches the door to go out. If I back out of the door and don't actually touch the door, that person can pick up my DNA. They're going to be leaving some of theirs through direct. And when they touch the door, they can leave some of their DNA and some of my DNA on the door. So without me ever touching the door, if you test it, now you've got my DNA. And studies have shown that these transfers can occur in controlled situations. We know they can occur up to 6 times. So from the bench to the door, to the bathroom door, to the sink, you might still be able to pick up that transfer. It is unknown how many times that may actually happen in reality, but we know we can do it up to 6 times in controlled circumstances.
Is there any way to test for whether that has occurred? That is, can you run a test to say this DNA is trace DNA because it was left there by the person, or whether it's transfer DNA, either first generation, second generation, etc.?
Again, with the trace, you can tell because that's simply an amount. How it got there, you cannot tell if it was from direct or from a secondary transfer or an indirect method. There's no way the DNA testing can do anything other than detect what is on that surface at the time it's collected.
Is there anything about the quantity of the sample that gives you any information about whether it is old, new, freshly left DNA?
The quantity does not generally give you that information. Looking at the profile that's generated might be able to give you some information of if the sample is starting to degrade, but the quantitation just tells you how much you have that you're starting with. And really, it only gives you a total amount. Sometimes you can break out the male component so that you can say, okay, I know I have a male component and I know I have a total component of DNA. But if you've got 6 people in a mixture and your DNA quantitation is telling you you have half a nanogram, well, that's plenty to get a profile if it's a single person. But the more people you put into it, they have to split that volume up. So that's when it's very difficult to tell, because when we quantitate it, we don't know how many people are in the mixture. We only know what the total value is to go into our amplification. It's not until we start seeing the profile that we start being able to give you a minimum number of people.
To recover a DNA profile, do you have to have some sort of biological material?
Yes, DNA is only found, or the DNA that we're testing for, being human DNA, is only found in biological substrates. So you would have to have something, whether it's skin cells or a body fluid, to get a DNA profile.
The amount of quantitative material that we've heard testify to in this case yesterday and today, is there anything about that amount that's inconsistent with it being a few skin cells?
No, the amounts, particularly in the YSTR testing, is very consistent with being a handful. I believe you may have heard up to 25 or around 25 cells. And generally, it takes us anywhere between 8 and 10 to start getting a DNA profile. And when we start looking at things like, cigarette butts or things that have large amounts of DNA in them, then yes, we have no trouble getting profiles out of those. That's lots of cells.
Is there any difference in, say, blood versus saliva or skin in the ability to extract the DNA sample?
Well, different body fluids will have different amounts of DNA. For instance, in blood, the DNA is actually coming out of your white blood cells, not your red blood cells. Your red blood cells don't have a nucleus. So it depends on the number of white blood cells you have, and that's pretty standard among people, unless you happen to have an infection, in which case you may have more white blood cells, or if you're immunocompromised, say HIV, leukemia, something like that, where you don't have as many white blood cells. Other than that, it can vary from body fluid to body fluid. Urine has some, saliva has a lot more. So sweat will have some DNA. It just depends on the person, the circumstances around how that body fluid is deposited, and which particular body fluid you may be dealing with.
So in short, is there any cut and dry way to say, well, if it's a lot of DNA sample material, it must be blood. If it's a small amount, it must be toenail, anything like that?
You can't tell from the quantity alone what sort of body fluid it's coming from.
I want to ask you about the degradation. You mentioned that. How does DNA degrade? What happens to it?
Well, DNA degrades basically by breaking down. And the way I like to tell people is basically what happens when DNA degrades is you just can't detect it anymore. It doesn't magically change into something else. So think of it this way. If you have a steak and you put it on your kitchen counter and you forget about it for a couple of days, and you come back and it's starting to turn into this mushy pool of stuff, you may not recognize it as a steak anymore, but it's certainly not chicken salad now. So it just turns into a form that we can't detect, we can't recognize. And generally this happens with the larger fragments of DNA first. So if you think of DNA as a strand, it's like a strand of spaghetti. When you start eating, well, when bacteria or other things start destroying the DNA, they start eating. It's like Pac-Man coming in from the ends. And the bigger pieces will disappear first because there's more room for something to attack it. The smaller it is, the more protected it is, which is why you can see in the profiles when they run on, it's called an electropherogram. It's basically a graph that gives us a visual representation of the DNA. The smaller pieces are on the left, the bigger pieces are on the right, because that's just how it runs through the instrument. The ones that will show up in a degraded sample will always be on the left-hand side of the page. You'll start seeing things disappear, and what you may see even is the peak heights start looking like a ski slope. They start going downhill. It's a very clear sign to us that something is going on with the sample, and the sample is starting to break down.
Is there any way to age a DNA sample?
Not really. The DNA, at least with the testing that we do, only shows you if it's starting to break down, but it can be fresh and starting to break down, and old stuff can still last. It just really depends on what conditions the sample have been through.
In your professional experience, have you had the opportunity to work with what is known to be old DNA?
Yes, I have.
And in what capacity is that?
I have worked with research groups and research studies with Civil War samples, as well as samples that come from a couple hundred years ago.
Let me stop you right there, just because we're making a record. You're referring to the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865?
That's correct. The American Civil War was a part of the group that worked on the USS Hunley, trying to determine who those people were that were in that submarine. We knew who the names were, but we didn't know which person's remains belongs to that name. I was a part of that group. I was also...
Well, let me stop you there. So in regards to the Hunley submarine from the Civil War, was you or your team able to extract DNA samples?
Yes, DNA samples were able to be extracted from that.
And was this submarine, had it been submerged underwater for over 100 years?
Yes, it had. And there have been other studies, historical artifacts that have come in. 1800s England was one set of samples that came in. So certainly old samples can have success in extracting DNA.
And so did you hear one of the experts in this case testify that Egyptian mummies over thousands of years old had DNA strands extracted?
Yes, absolutely.
And do you agree with that?
Yes.
And is there, let me ask you about what conditions would cause a DNA sample to degrade over time?
Well, the major conditions that cause samples to degrade: excessive heat, excessive moisture, those are the two big ones. Exposure to chemicals, especially harsh chemicals like bleach. Direct sunlight or direct UV light can start causing the DNA to break. It doesn't disappear, but what it does is it actually can cut the DNA into smaller pieces. Those are the big ones that we generally try to watch out for when it comes to DNA samples.
Let me ask you a hypothetical. If someone is on exposed skin, hands and knees, in carpet, for an extended period of time, would you expect to be able to find skin cells and therefore DNA strands in that carpet?
If that person was moving around, I would expect that. If they're playing, one of the games like Twister where you just hold the position forever, maybe in that area where they are. But if you're actively moving around, then yes, anytime you have that abrasive force, it's going to remove skin cells onto that surface.
What if someone were sweating while they were doing that? Could you potentially find DNA from the sweat that was deposited?
Potentially, yes.
What what if the person in doing that work also cut their fingers and bled? Would you expect to find DNA there as well?
Yes, definitely, if there was blood.
And if all of that occurred inside of a home that had a roof, four walls, and temperature control, would you expect that DNA to last longer before degrading?
As opposed to being out in the elements,
Yes.
then yes, I would expect it to last longer than being in the elements.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like there often is no way though to make that determination. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. In forensic science, we only know what's in the sample when we get it. We rarely have any sort of historical background as to what that sample has been through or what the object that that sample came from has been through.
In the hypothetical that I gave you about the carpet, is there any scientific way to know if that DNA would still be there 2 years later versus 5 years later?
The only way to know that would be to test it, 2 years later or 5 years later. You can't just look at a carpet and say, okay, I'm going to test this and see if we get something, and it happened 2 years ago in here. You don't know what's there until you test it.
But would it be possible to do those tests by perhaps doing a swab of the carpet?
Yes,
And if that carpet that I've described in the hypothetical were swabbed in a number of places, would it be possible to recover DNA from that, if it had previously been possible?
if there was DNA that was on that carpet, then yes, you should be able to recover it.
If that carpet had not been subjected to sunlight or chemicals as you described, would that make it more likely that you would find that DNA there later?
Yes.
Ross, I think those are all my questions.
All right, Cross.
Judge, could I have 10 minutes to consult with my experts as well? Maybe have the afternoon break?
Okay, sure, we'll take a 2-minute break.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All rise. We'll be in 10-minute recess.